Often the presenters here are people with a professional background in religion or the, shall we say, softer studies, psychology, and so on. I'm an engineer. I'm also a hopeless nerd. I love technology. I have lived and played with technology all of my life. And I'm probably also a rebel at heart somewhere. My curiosity in terms of being enamored by new technology also sort of drags me into try to look at life with fresh eyes, always exploring, examining things from different angles. In my engineering life, which is in the world of electronics and software, I've always dreamed of crazy, innovative ideas. But we have the wonderful thing in engineering of physical things. It has to be proven in real life that the airplane will fly, that the software will run, that the iPhone will get on the web and work reliably. That's a different game when you're in religion, because we talk about things that we don't know a whole lot about. And that's what is so fascinating about it. And in my careers, in my crazy ideas, had some world-class successes, and I've also had some devastating failures. And both have been healthy because you also learn from your failures. So as I say, religion it deals fundamentally with things we can't see, we can't measure, we can't taste, feel. And therefore, from an engineering mind, I still say it has to be proven to work in real life. Jesus also said that. He said, by their fruits shall you know them. And that's sort of the litmus test of anything. Religion has to fly, airplanes have to fly. So with that intro, I'll share my screen with you all. Did you hear the you all? I lived in Texas for a while also. So, and see if I can find, where is my, there it is. I have too many windows open. I'll only share one of them with you guys. Is that coming up for you?
Yeah, we are seeing a sidebar, because I'm seeing a sidebar.
All right, I have to hit the play button, and we'd actually practice this before. How's that now?
I still see the sidebar. Is that me or is that you? Well, it looks like it must be you.
You're still seeing, you're not seeing the window alone?
No, I'm seeing your screen, but it's getting cut off on the right-hand side with the sidebar. Beyond, do you see what I'm seeing?
I do. Carsten, can you try hitting play again?
Yeah, let me just...
I mean, because it was working for you last time.
Yeah, it was, right. Let me just go back to the sharing on Zoom, because we did a rehearsal of this, and, it doesn't work now. Just a second, hang on. Go to my Zoom window here, hang on a second. Bring to front. You are screen sharing, it says. All right. Is it sharing my entire screen? Maybe so.
No. Well, okay. Now we're to a black. Okay.
Now we killed it. Then there's a share screen button, but it should have an option to share only a given window. Doesn't it have that?
Yeah. Typically, when you share the PowerPoint, it does take over the window.
All right. Hang on a second.
Definitely did have it.
This is so embarrassing. And I used to work in multimedia quite a bit. And then Murphy's Law is working very well today. All right. I will then, just a second, I'll put this in play mode, and then I'll go down and say share. Here we go. Share screen.
There we go.
Got it.
Awesome.
Good. I
Yeah.
apologize for the mess up. Like to just tell you a little bit about where I am from and what my background is. I was born in Denmark in 1949 at near the Danish sanitarium in Skodsborg, Denmark. The founder of that was one of the restless people like John Harvey Kellogg, who started the sanitarium in Battle Creek. Dr. Ottesen in Denmark visited Kellogg in Battle Creek, and with a fire in his belly, he came back and started an Adventist sanitarium in Denmark. Both of my parents worked there, and this is quite common. That's also where they met each other during World War II. And as you know, those times, the rules were strict. When they started dating, they walked along the coastal highway. They claimed one on one side of the street and the other on the other side of the street. No holding hands or things like that allowed. 9 years old, my dad was 50 years old at that time, and I moved with the family to the United States in 1958. And where did we move to? Of course, to Battle Creek, Michigan, from one sanitarium to another. And that's where my parents worked until their retirement. I was baptized as an 11-year-old after an effort, as they called it in the old days, by Fortis Dedamore, who packed the Battle Creek Tabernacle to the overflowing almost. And I never will forget the Sunday night where it was by admission only, the very, very special secret lecture about the mark of the beast. And you had to have tickets to come hear that. And that Sunday night, to a packed audience, he talked about the Catholic Church. I was enthralled and captivated by his preaching. And it was a fascinating process. And shortly thereafter, in November, I was baptized in Denmark. As I write, I accepted it all, hook, line, and sinker. Started in Battle Creek Academy as in the 4th grade, and I graduated from there in 1967, played the trumpet and band, and I think one of our listeners on Adventist Today, Richard Myers, he was a band teacher for a while in Battle Creek while I was there. So I've been in the core of Adventism for many, many parts of my life. We had many visitors from Scandinavia. And in my time at Battle Creek, it was often my job on Sabbath afternoon, as visitors from Scandinavia came over, to show them around to the historical sites of Battle Creek. So I drove them to Wood Street and showed them the house where Ellen White in the upstairs room wrote The Great Controversy. I showed them her grave in the Oak Hill Cemetery in Battle Creek, and on and on. I was deeply involved in the church. I had a wonderful aunt in Battle Creek. She was a retired nurse from the U.S. Army after 25 years of service. And since my folks didn't get off work until 5 o'clock in the afternoon, she came and picked me up at Battle Creek Academy at 4 o'clock and drove me home. A kind, loving soul who did much for us and our family. But this wonderful aunt was also a member of the Worldwide Church of God with Herbert W. Armstrong, if any of you remember that name. She was also a member of the John Birch Society. And sometimes on the rides home, I got some of the most terrible things that I cannot quote directly that she said to me about the Jews, about the communists, and about the blacks. And growing up with getting that type of dosage of racial hatred, or whatever you want to call it, from this person who was so kind to us, was sort of a hard thing to understand. And it took me many years of living in this waspy environment before I actually recognized what was going on. From Battle Creek, I moved on to Andrews and got my bachelor's in math and physics and worked at the college radio station. We had WAUR, which only sent to the college dormitories, the boys and girls or men and women's dormitories. And there we played vegetarian rock, carefully selected soft rock. And of course, the teachers couldn't hear it because they were in the dormitory. So we had to make a set of rules for playing good kosher music. In 1970, the school decided to build a public radio station, which would broadcast to a 60-mile radius. And having messed with electronics, I hadn't happened to have a license. So I got the job of building WAUS 90.9. It was on your FM dial back then. And that was a fascinating experience. I ran into a Danish girl after being a couple of years postgraduate at Andrews and moved to Denmark and married her and worked for a prominent Danish electronics manufacturer for about 20 years. And I write in my little write-up that in working for these worldly electronics firms, I've actually been blessed to find that the Gentiles, as we sometimes call them, aren't as bad as we make them out to be. I primarily met kind, sincere, creative, highly ethical, and caring individuals. I've seen God bless all of his own creatures, regardless of their creed. That was a real revelation for me compared to what I've been fed as a child. And that was a great blessing. After working on major engineering projects in Denmark until 1993, I got a job offer in Austin, Texas, and I was working as the vice president of engineering of a company called National Instruments in Austin, Texas for 7 years. And when I got a job offer to move to Austin, the first knee-jerk was reaction, I don't want to work with those rednecks down south. It was a surprising move because Austin happens to be a liberal oasis in Texas. But even with all the ultra-conservative people there, I've never encountered such a group of kind and considerate individuals anywhere in my life. And it taught me something about preconceived notions that can really impact you quite a bit. And it taught me also that traveling internationally, which I did a lot of, I think I've crossed the Atlantic probably 200 times in my life. It's been healthy because encountering different cultures worldwide, I learned that you cannot view everything from an American perspective and not view everything from an Adventist perspective. While in Austin, Texas, it was just after the horrific events of Waco. And perhaps you can see the Time magazine that I'm holding up here with Koresh on the cover. I visited Mount Carmel after the raid and the terrible deathly fire. And it brought home to me that religion is important, but fanaticism can drive any religion way over the edge and turn it to some of the most evil things that you can imagine. I still remember visiting what they had, a little primitive visitor center, an old shed established on the grounds where everything else had burned down. And in that shed, there were some of the half-melted children's bicycles exhibited. And on the walls of the shed were copies of some of the last pages of the last few chapters of a book that we all know called The Great Controversy. Pages that help inspire David Koresh to almost have a death wish to participate in those terrible last days that are described in The Great Controversy. It struck my heart with pain to see how he had used those as a fuel for his fire, as a fuel for him to proclaim himself as the Son of God that had to do what Jesus had not done. Jesus did not sin, so he had to sin on behalf of Jesus. So David Koresh had to go in and break into the marriages of the married couples living at Mount Carmel. And the wives became his concubines. And he had the job, the holy task of inseminating them with his divine genetic material. That's shocking. And since then, I've always been very careful about religion because it deals with something that almost is a build your own buffet. And if you just extrapolate into doing and thinking things that never meet the real life test of, is it ethical? Is it kind? Is it loving? Is it bearing good fruit? It can just go anywhere into destructive insanity, as it did with David Koresh. There are families that I knew in Battle Creek who died in the fire in Waco. They were interviewed by Time magazine, and one of their relatives is quoted as saying, after talking with David Koresh on the phone for 20 minutes, I didn't know what I believed in anymore. He was so skilled in using the Bible and using the quotes of Ellen White that this person who had grown up as a solid Adventist was pulled around by the nose. And in 20 minutes, David Koresh could basically tear down everything this person had ever learned and been taught. It's been shocking. 7 wonderful years in Austin. I promised only to take the job for 3 years and hung on for 7 years. And then it was back to Denmark again. And there I again worked in engineering for 19 years. And for the past 8 years, I've been a widower, having lost my wife to cancer as only a 65-year-old to the infamous triple-negative breast cancer. Takes 1 year to snuff out a life much too early. So that also impacts one's view on life. Here's my baptismal certificate with the baptismal vow. We'll come back to that because associated with that inside the certificate are the 27 fundamental beliefs of the Adventist Church. Lauren asked me to say, why did I write this 10 celebration things? I heard Ted Wilson's sermon on the web in the fall of 21, and I was just pained and sad by his sermon concentrating for over an hour about the threats facing the Adventist Church. It struck me as intolerant. It struck me as being negative. That obviously wasn't his desire to be that way, but that's the way I perceived it, and it hurt. I'll be so harsh as to say I felt it was unchristian. It hurts to say that. He's a well-meaning man, but that's how it struck me. And a lot of my friends also have had the same reactions. I went to bed and woke up at 3 a.m. in the morning, and the blood was still boiling. And I remember some wise person once said to me, Carsten, remember, take your anger and your negative energy and turn it into something positive. So I sat up in bed, grabbed my Mac, and wrote the first draft of the 10 celebrations of the wonderful things in Adventist theology, trying to reframe it in a positive light. I'm tired of being negative. And to be honest, Spectrum and Adventists today, for all the good work that they're doing, also attract people who have a troubled relationship with the church. I'm now 73 years old. I don't want to live the rest of my life being critical and negative. I'm tired of being perceived as negative. I'm tired of being attracted to scandal in the church. I remember the General Conference in 2015. I was viewing it on a summer house in France in Alsace on my iPad. And I heard Ted Wilson speaking about the vote on women's ordination. And he says, let's move on now to something more important. Let us not be distracted by these things. And I said, he's just trampled on the majority of the members of the Adventist church. I was so angry, I wanted to smash my iPad. How could he do that? That's my perception. Whether that was his intention, that's not for me to judge. I can only say how I reacted. I'm tired of wanting to smash my iPad. I'm tired of criticizing the leadership of the General Conference. That's why I wrote an article recently about how one can see the successes of the General Conference. And obviously, I've been on a long spiritual journey. When I was young, I was ultra-conservative. I was incredibly intolerant. I was convinced that the Adventist Church was the only true religion in the world, and everybody else was on a wrong path. And through the years, from traveling internationally, from thinking about things, I've been on a long, perhaps winding road, and I've traveled a path to what some might call liberal or progressive, or people have to my face also said, you're a fallen Adventist, you're not a true Adventist. And in that path, it's been important for me to look back and remember where I was. And for us as Adventists, so-called liberals, there's one thing that we have to be very careful with, because liberals are open-minded and so on. But somewhere deep inside, we have a very hard time stomaching intolerant people, intolerant conservative people. And with Trump running for president in 2015 and becoming elected, I had many friends from Battle Creek who were died in the wolf Trump supporters. And I felt that the biggest issue with that is not Trump, but why were so many people following him? What was missing in their lives? Why couldn't I communicate with them anymore? People who I've gone to school with, who I've gone to church with. And I tried to walk in their moccasins and read their literature and watch Fox and read Breitbart. And I decided to read the whole spectrum from left to right, trying to understand it. And we as so-called progressives must never look down at the conservatives or reactionaries, as we call them. That's not the loving kindness that the Lord asks us to do. We have to show tolerance to those that we disagree with. We have to show love to those that we perceive as not showing love. And in my spiritual journey, I also recognize that other people are on their own spiritual journey. We follow different paths at different speeds. And we have to recognize that every person has a right to see through the glass darkly and now seeing more clearly, as Paul says, at different speeds, and have a tolerance and an ability to accommodate each other. The religion for me must also not be a Fortis Dedamore hand-me-down religion. I had to look in the mirror and say, Carsten, what do you believe? I had to be honest to myself. That's a tough thing. So my goal in writing this is that I want to raise our view of Ellen White by focusing more on the Bible that she points to, where she is secondary to the Bible, as she herself said. I want to raise our view of the Bible by focusing more on the Jesus that the Bible points to. I want to read in my basic theology. I view the entire Bible, from the Old Testament to the writings of Paul and the epistles, through the eyes of Jesus. I see him as the ultimate revelation, and we must read all the other holy writings, listening to his voice and his viewpoint. And this may be heretical, but for me, it's not sola scriptura, it's sola Jesus. I don't want to worship the Bible, and for us to be known as people of the Bible. No, I don't want to be known of that. I want to worship the Lord of the Bible. That's what I want to be known for. I want a big tent in Adventism that can accommodate people on their individual journeys along the way, where they're evolving and learning and growing together. I want to see the renewed vigor and discussion that was characterized by the early Adventists. I want to remember that the late teenagers, 17, 18, 19-year-olds who participated in the Great Disappointment, these were our founding fathers and mothers. And when I formulated that night at 3 a.m., my 10 celebrations of Adventism, I deliberately wanted to raise it up, to build a house not on rock, to build it on rocks and not on sand. And I wanted to avoid what I call a house of cards religion. You've probably heard it. If we don't believe in a literal creation, what happens then? Then the Sabbath falls. If you don't believe in a literal creation, you don't believe in Ellen White. Then you don't believe in the sanctuary service. Then there's nothing unique about Adventism. The entire house of cards of Adventism falls. I don't want a faith that is that weak. I think the God that I want to worship wants us to have a strong faith that can stand up to the storm and the test of time. So I want to learn from the mistakes that we've had in Adventism. And those mistakes have been very valuable. The sanctuary service, as shortly revealed to someone of an interpretation that the cleansing of the sanctuary was now something that occurred in heaven. I think many Adventist theologians today believe that that is probably not a correct interpretation. but I see it as a necessary interpretation and a useful interpretation, because it helped that young flock to survive the disappointment of today, October 22, and to move on, energized by a reinterpretation, showing flexibility, and then create the great Advent movement. It may have been wrong, but it was useful in getting the church started. So here is a document that you cannot read. This is on the inside of my baptismal certificate from November 1958. And I'll just read the first item on that summary of doctrinal beliefs. I believe in the true and living God. The first person of the Godhead is our Heavenly Father, and he, by his Son, Christ Jesus, created all things. Period. I think most of you know how that is formulated today by a vote of the General Conference. So with that summary of saying, I'm tired of being tired, I want to celebrate the good news the Lord has given to us. I want to formulate, for me at least, something that I personally believe 100%, that perhaps avoids some of the pitfalls that I have felt, and also takes one step back in terms of trying to be too specific about what we know about God and his timetables. Do we really know God's timetables in the creation of the world? Do we really know his timetables when he's coming again? I sometimes feel it can be blasphemous for us to put train or airline schedules on what the Lord is doing. I think we need to step back and say, my God, how great thou art, and let God do what he wants to do in his time. Here are the 10 points that are my formulation. I'm not saying that they're right. I'm just saying this is a snapshot where I'm at in my life. You may or may not be able to identify with it. That's fine. We're all different individuals. And the thing that I love about the Bible, that there's something that speaks to every personality type in the Bible, where there's something that can appeal to people of their situation in life that makes it incredible, meaningful, and deep. I believe that the Bible is the inspired story of man's relationship to God, of man's view and understanding of the divine through the ages. It may sound a little heretical in some people's ears that I say that it is a revelation of man's view of God. What we're seeing in the Old Testament is how, at that time, men interpreted God. And there I'm using men in the inclusive form of the word to be politically correct, if I can be that. And we see an evolution there of man's view of God. And the Old Testament, for all its terrible and horrific stories, asking Abraham to sacrifice his son, seeing the apostasy of David and Solomon, seeing the infidelity, and seeing Abraham and Isaac as liars about their wives, trying to save their own skin and saying that their wives were the sisters so that Pharaoh wouldn't take them in as his concubines. I celebrate the Old Testament also because it shows a God who dealt with imperfect people, people of the faith, people that Paul celebrates as the fathers of our faith, flawed people, a flawed, chosen people, constantly falling and coming back. It shows a patient, incredibly patient God, a much more patient God than I think I would ever be. And that's great. And I believe that all of the Bible, especially the Old Testament, must be read through the eyes of Jesus, whom I believe is the closest revelation of the divine that has ever been given to us. In Jesus' word, he says, Moses said, but I say. The Old Testament is characterized by Israel being almost in constant war with the countries around it, with the Gentiles and so on. They win some, they lose some. They go into captivity, they're freed from captivity. They fall into idolatry, they come back again. And Jesus says this warring and this enemies picture, it's over. Love your neighbor as yourself. Love your enemies. Jesus' message is a fantastic contrast, as I read it, to the view of the authors of the Old Testament who describe this non-stop war. And on that contrast of Jesus' message to the warring going on in the Old Testament, it makes his message to me so much more refreshing, so much more life-giving and dynamic. And yes, there are wonderful passages in the Old Testament talking about love and care and so on. And that does shine through, but it's a background of a nation at war all the time. And I feel Jesus said, time out. It's a new way of living. It may be a simplistic way of looking at the Bible, but it also makes it easier for me to read the Old Testament. I don't have to justify the things that went on in the Old Testament. I don't have to justify David being a man after God's heart after he lusts after a beautiful woman taking her evening bath and sends her husband to a certain death. I don't have to justify that. I only say there's a wonderful God who accepts us where we are, who accepts me with all my warts and quirks and sins and weaknesses, still accepts me. And that leads me to the second point. Adventism I see as a dynamic Adventist identity. In the early church, when you study the history of the church, the Ellen White of 1850 or 1860 or 70 is not the same Ellen White of 1900, where she was in exile in Australia, or 1910, or up to her death. She evolved in her life. Her early Adventism was fraught with the visions of perdition and the risk of losing your soul. It was more characterized by a faith of works. In her later years, she became a softer, more loving in the things that she wrote. Who did Ellen White side with in 1888? She sided with the young rebels, preaching righteousness by faith, which was in direct opposition to the leadership of the General Conference. Isn't it fantastic that our church were driven by people of courage? I just love to read that story. They didn't give up. And they had the courage also to stand up against what they perceived as being wrong in the church leadership. And obviously the leadership of the church had to do something about that. So they gave her a call to Australia. And in the book, The Prophetess and the Presidents, we read about the very painful relationship she had with the presidents of the General Conference. Adventism was alive, it was kicking, it was renewing itself constantly. I love reading that story. I also love reading that there were mistakes in Adventism and they weren't swept under the rug. The mistakes in the Bible weren't swept under the rug. David's idolatry is clearly and concisely described. And the evolution of the church from its early stumbles in misinterpreting scripture, misinterpreting the end of the world on this fateful date. They picked up the pieces, they learned and moved on, and tried not to repeat too many of the mistakes. That dynamic Adventism gives it life. It gives the ability to meet people where they are. I believe in the grand prophecies that God gave, both in the Old and the New Testaments. They paint grand murals of mystery and power of the divine. In these prophecies, I personally find a very deep spiritual meaning that is relevant for every culture and every generation. The message is simple. God loves us, and the good will win. It's told in many, many different ways. And that ultimate victory, as Ellen White so wonderfully writes in the last lines of The Great Controversy, where love triumphs over evil, that love is not only cosmically, but the most important great controversy for me is a great controversy in my heart, the battle for my soul, the tug of war between good and evil in me. That's where the battle of Armageddon, personally, for me, is won or lost. And that thread of these prophecies talking about the battle between good and evil, not only cosmically, but in our hearts, is a wonderful message for me. The miracle of creation. As an engineer, I like to explain everything. And as I learn more and more in studying my nerdishness of science and technology and astronomy and the new James Webb telescope and so on, I find that my knowledge decreases day for day compared to the incomprehensible power and miracle of the divine. Yes, God can easily have created a world in 6 or 7 literal days. But what's important is that he did something miraculous. And I don't want to lock God into my perceptions of the days described in the Bible. I read Genesis as a story that tries in human words, which are so limited in what they can express, to describe something that is so grand, so mystical, so mind-blowing, that I have to take a step back and say, my God, how great thou art. A few months ago, I talked with a researcher at the Copenhagen University, working with a technology called CRISPR. This is the technology of gene splicing. Oh, this is terrible. We're messing with the foundations of life. That's one reaction. And I said, tell me, how do you splice one set of genes into another gene? As I understand it, when I read the book about the woman who won the Nobel Prize for that, I said, tell me, how does this work? As I understand it, you don't have microscopic scissors that cut the RNA strands apart and splice in new things. You just put it in some fluids with some enzymes and other things, and then nature does it by itself. Is that a correct understanding? I asked her. Yes, it is. And then she looked at me and she says, Carsten, it's absolutely mind-blowing that we're just bystanders enabling nature to do these things. I don't know whether she believes in God or not, but she says that she's working with something that as an assistant, heating and putting enzymes in nature does these miraculous things of splicing the RNA and DNA chain. It's a miracle that for all the technologists and all that we know about that, when we look out in the universe, I stand humbled in awe of what I don't understand. And I feel a joy and a responsibility of being a co-creator with God. I mean, most human beings are able to participate in creating new life. The most boring books of the Bible chronicles, they actually celebrate us being co-creators. And he knew his wife and gave birth to. That wonderful, mind-blowing miracle of sexual intercourse, of co-creation, creating two cells that join into one and become a human being created in God's image. It's mind-blowing. And associated with creation, whether it was in literal 6 days or not, the beauty of that 7-day cycle, which is embedded in most of the cultures of the world, is a wonderful, beautiful, divine-given cycle with a day of rest. And some rest on Friday, some on Saturday, and some on Sunday. And those who live near the date line end up fighting each other when the date line gets moved back and forth. God has given us a blessing to rest on the Sabbath. What a fantastic thing. I believe in a Jesus of love. When I read about Jesus in the gospel, I saw that he drew a line in the sand. He wanted to lift our sights to look at the divine principles of the love of God and for our fellow man. Oh, it's just cheap grace, Carsten. That love is not cheap. It's expensive. And we often say Jesus died for our sins. He also died for another reason. Jesus died because he was too good. His embrace of all, high and low, sinners, prostitutes, taxpayers, the people that were looked down upon. He was such a thorn in the eye for the religious establishment. They couldn't tolerate his goodness. That was such a stinging rebuke of their narrow interpretation of the laws. So they arranged for the Romans to take care of him, a real mafia-style execution. They had the Romans as their hitman. Jesus died because he was too good. And the thing that is positive in that view, which is perhaps my own view of it, is that because he took and carried the burden of being too good or trying to be too good, he relieved me of that because I cannot be too good. And I don't have to suffer that fate. I am a sinner. And he took the penalty of being too good. So I don't have to strive to be good. I don't have to strive to be saved. He took care of that. It's to me, a wonderful, positive message. I think God has given us not only a conscience and an intellect and common sense, and he trusts us to apply that to all aspects of our lives, also including the way we interpret religion, so we don't veer off the road like David Koresh did. For some, it's scary to be freed from narrow, specific rules. And many people are attracted to Adventism because it has things well defined, what you're allowed to eat and do and not do. God trusts us. If we live by the principles, I believe that he trusts us to do what we believe is right in a given situation. Carsten, situational ethics, that doesn't cut it. You've heard it before. That's not the Jesus that I read about in the Bible. This is probably one of the difficult ones here. I believe all moral viewpoints must be derived from love. And in my work in the real world, as I call it, working with the world of the Gentiles, I've never worked for the church in my professional life. I see the character of God reflected in just about all the people I meet. Yes, there are people who we call evil, but somewhere inside every person, I believe there's the spirit of the divine, the image of God there. It's hard to find sometimes. And I've been so pleased to see God's love embedded in all kinds of people, be it in China or in Japan, or when I've been in Singapore or Australia or wherever in the world I've been. I see love to your family and love to the fellow man as something that is universal, and it's God-given to everybody. But in the recent years, the complexities of sexuality have made life very challenging and difficult. And growing up in the pure binary world, I am inherently repulsed by homosexuality. That's my knee-jerk reaction. I'll be the first to admit that. I don't understand it. I can't relate to it because I don't have those impulses myself. But I learned through life and meeting people, wonderful people who are homosexuals, that God has given them his love also and his gift. And when I look at Jesus' ability to love everyone, the outcast and so on, I have to park my intolerance and follow his example. I had to overcome that innate repulsion and revulsion that I have felt and follow Christ's example. Remember that all humankind, we're all created in God's image. We're all siblings. We're all sons and daughters of the same God who loves us all. It's a mind-blowing message. It's tough, but it's fantastic. We then come to the core of Seventh-day Adventism, the advent of joy and hope. I look at it. I'm no longer worried about last-day events. I'm no longer worried about persecution and so on. I believe in an advent of Jesus where he pointed to a second coming, where he would make all things new. But there's the obvious cognitive dissonance. We've preached, he's coming soon, he's coming soon, he's coming soon. And it isn't happening. How long can we cry wolf and say that? And then one day it dawned on me that, Carsten, maybe there is a spiritual meaning to that. Oh yes, the moment we die, then we see Jesus. That's the next thing. Jesus came to the earth 2,000 years ago and says, I will come again soon. And that soon happened to me when Fortis Dedamore revealed for me not only the unique things of Adventism, but also the infinite love of God. When I was baptized as an 11-year-old, I was swept off my feet. Jesus came to me again at that point in time. And as I went in my spiritual journey, I was moved again when I rediscovered the love of God, the love represented by Jesus, which frees me of my guilt, which frees me from the burden of not being good enough, that gives me a confidence of a God who loves me unconditionally. Wow, that's fantastic. It's just like the whole orchestra and the angels coming in the skies, that feeling that you have when you're suddenly freed from that. So that became a second or a third coming for me. And yes, we have a hope. We have this hope we sing that he will come again in the skies. But for me now, resting in the confidence of his love here now has given me peace and removed my fear and removed my inadequacy and removed my guilt. And the second coming has become an advent of joy and hope for me. The sanctuary service I see as a celebration of freedom. There's both a beautiful symbolism in the sanctuary service, but there's also an ugly, gross symbolism in that. Sacrifice, blood being splattered all over the place. Isaac being sacrificed. Jesus being nailed to the cross with a crown of thorns. It's ugly. It's gross and disgusting. I've never gone in to see the film by, what's his name, Gibson, the Crucifixion of Christ. We have a symbol adorning our churches, and often as jewelry adorning an emblem hanging around our necks, a murderous symbol. We wouldn't carry around a gas mask or a machine gun or an electric chair, but we carry a cross. It is also gross. And I want to turn that grossness into something positive. I want to turn the sanctuary, which is a scary thing that the doors of probation are closing and so on. I believe that sanctuary service points to the dramatic sacrifice of Christ, where he once and for all frees us from fear, frees us from sin, frees us from fear of death. He frees us from not being good enough. And in the symbolism of the sanctuary, I see that he gives a comfort to all generations, not just the last generations now, but to anyone reading the Bible anywhere, that he is a just and loving God. And I celebrate that wonderful message of the sanctuary, and I'm thankful for it. We have our prophet, Ellen G. White, and she has played a pivotal role as a guiding light in, and I want to use the word, revolutionary development of the Adventist Church. When you read about the early Adventists who got kicked out of the Methodist Church, she and much of the other gang, they were rebels. They were starting a rocking and rolling revolution. They were charismatics. You can read how in the late 40s, they got together and fainted as they were celebrating together loudly in the privacy of their homes. And the local police came out and said, turn it down, turn it down. I don't want to invite you to spend the night cooling off in jail. They were really holy rollers, the early Adventists. Isn't that fantastic to see them so energized and see how they evolved and developed and so on? I once, in a Sabbath school many years ago, where we were discussing Ellen White and clean meats and so on, And I had picked a statement from the testimonies where she said, "Dear Brother X, if it is God's will that we should not eat flesh meat or the pig's meat or swine flesh, he will reveal it to more than one or two people and to you." And the church just said, "What? Did Ellen White write that?" Yes. And Ellen White also wrote, "Go down and get me some fresh oysters. The ones you got yesterday weren't very good." She changed. She developed. She evolved. Isn't it fantastic? She had a spiritual journey also. She evolved in helping develop a church with a deeper understanding of God's love. Her prophetic voice speaks today, and it encourages me to not have a stagnant view of God and to be flexible and creative as we move forward, as she was flexible and creative. Finally, I believe in the beauty of the diversity that we have. God can speak to us in multiple languages, multiple cultural expressions. Jesus came and met the people on earth where they were. When we walk out in the world or talk with our neighbors or our children, the first thing I believe that we must do is listen and meet them where they are and not preach. Understand their problems, their challenges, their languages, their view on life. Jesus came and listened. He came and healed. He guided us in love. And I believe that Jesus encourages us to reflect his love to all mankind and celebrate the diversity of cultures and sexual identities and professions and where we are in our own spiritual journeys. I think Jesus, he wants us to build a tent of his love that is wide and loving and encompassing. Those are the things that make me happy about Adventism. These are the things that mean that I don't want to be negative anymore. I'm tired of being tired. I want to celebrate the wonderful things that it has given to us. I wrote in my article back in October of last year, I felt like resigning my membership after hearing the Autumn Council there. I've decided to make my own brand of Adventism. Am I loyal to the church or not? I don't know. Some people say I am. In my local church, I feel safe. I feel accepted. I feel a love and a tolerance that I enjoy. I'm not leaving the church. Thank you for listening.